The voice of Sovereign Kethver suddenly filled every speaker across human ships, stations, and colonies at the exact same moment. There was no warning and no introduction, only a calm declaration delivered in a slow and certain tone. Humanity had 30 cycles to surrender. Its colonies would become breath territory, its military would be dismantled, and its people would live under breath rule. This was not presented as a discussion or a negotiation. It was simply a timetable. The transmission ended inside the Galactic Conclave Assembly Station, where 300 diplomatic representatives from 40 different species sat in complete silence. Some of them had heard that voice before, and they knew very well what usually followed it. 17 civilizations had received that same message in the past, and 17 civilizations had vanished as independent peoples shortly afterward. Commander Alar Vass sat at the Terran table. She was a small woman with short gray hair and steady brown eyes, and nothing about her expression suggested panic or fear. Instead, she looked like someone who had just been handed a document with the wrong answer written across it. Her aide, a young man named Owen Clark, leaned slightly closer to her and spoke in a quiet voice. "Commander, should I prepare a response draft?" Alar did not look at him. Her eyes remained fixed on the empty space where the transmission had appeared moments earlier. "Tell them we decline," she said. Owen blinked. Just that dot across the chamber, the Breath Ambassador turned slowly toward the Terran delegation. He was a tall, scaled creature with 4 eyes and a chest that looked like a carved wall of stone. He had expected panic or desperate bargaining. At the very least, he had expected a request for more time. Instead, he saw a human officer already reaching for her communication device, already moving on to the next task, as if the most powerful empire in the known galaxy had simply delivered a routine weather forecast. He did not yet understand humans. The rest of the assembly watched carefully. Most of the species present believed the conflict would end quickly. The Breath Dominion controlled 42 star systems and commanded a fleet large enough to darken the sky of an entire world. Their soldiers stood 2.5 meters tall and had been raised for war since the moment they were born. Humanity possessed 12 colony worlds, a mid-sized fleet, and roughly 400 years of recorded space travel by every calculation. The numbers did not favor humanity, but numbers were not the only factor in play. Alar Vass left the station less than an hour later. She gave no interviews and held no press conference. She simply boarded her shuttle, opened a secure channel to Earth, and spoke a single sentence before the connection was encrypted. "Activate Iron Shepherd." The reply returned in under 10 seconds. Confirmed. Iron Shepherd is active. Back on Earth, inside a command center 3 levels beneath the city of Geneva, Admiral Leon Faro slowly set his coffee down on the edge of the console and studied the wall of screens in front of him. The displays showed star maps, fleet locations, supply corridors, and intelligence reports that extended deep into Breath territory. Much of that information had been gathered quietly over 15 years, assembled piece by piece with patience and almost no public attention. Pharaoh was 61 years old, and for the last decade and a half, he had been preparing for a war he sincerely hoped would never arrive. Now that it had, he did not look surprised. He turned slightly toward the officers standing behind him and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "Everyone knows their assignment. No speeches. Get to work." They got to work immediately. Across the Terran Union, systems that had been quiet for years suddenly began moving again. Ships listed as inactive in maintenance registries appeared in docking bays fully fueled and operational. Supply depots marked as closed in public records quietly opened their storage vaults and began routing equipment to military transports. Soldiers who had completed classified training programs during the previous 3 years received sealed orders, and packed their gear without explaining to their families where they were going. None of these movements were visible to outside observers, and that had always been the intention. Meanwhile, back at the Conclave Station, the Breath Ambassador prepared his report to send to his sovereign. In the message, he described the human response as arrogant and reckless. He explained that humanity had refused the ultimatum with a confidence that he believed would vanish once the first Breath fleet appeared at the edge of Terran space. According to his prediction, when the reality of breath power arrived, the humans would quickly reconsider their answer. He was partially correct. The humans did change their answer. They made it shorter. 12 days later, the first Breath fleet crossed the border marker that separated Dominion space from Terran territory. The ships moved forward in a massive formation, their commanders expecting to encounter a defensive line of human vessels ready to negotiate or delay the inevitable. Instead, they found nothing waiting for them at all. No fleet, no stations, and no signals. Only silent, empty space stretching in every direction. The Breath Fleet commander ordered a long-range scan and transmitted the results to his superiors. The report showed no meaningful human presence anywhere near the border. From his perspective, the explanation was obvious. Humanity had seen the Dominion fleet and retreated in fear. Confident in that conclusion, he advanced deeper into Terran space without hesitation. But what he interpreted as fear was actually patience. Back in Geneva, Leon Farrow watched the movement of the Breath fleet on the display wall without speaking for a long moment. Standing beside him was a younger officer named Grace Dunn, a strategist who had written her doctoral thesis on breath, military doctrine, and had spent the last 6 years ensuring that Iron Shepherd accounted for every predictable element of bad doctrine. She studied the data streams carefully before speaking. "They are moving faster than the projected timeline." "Yes," Farrow replied quietly. "Does that change anything?" He kept his eyes on the display, showing 40 Breath warships moving in a confident line toward the colony world of New Carthage. "Tell SI to be ready 3 days early," he said. Grace was already reaching for a communication device before he finished the sentence. On a troop transport drifting quietly through the darkness between stars, Staff Sergeant Dara Osai received a short, encrypted message. It arrived without greeting or explanation, a single instruction appearing on the small screen mounted beside his bunk. The message read only 4 words. 3 days early. You know what to do." Dara read the line once, then folded the screen shut and slipped the device back into his pocket. He walked down the narrow corridor toward the cargo bay where the rest of his unit was resting. When he told them the order had changed, no one asked questions. They had trained for this moment for years, repeating the same drills until every movement had become automatic. They knew what the signal meant, even if they did not yet know how far the plan would go. The Breath fleet arrived at the colony world of New Carthage, expecting resistance that would last perhaps 3 days. The settlement held roughly 600,000 residents and maintained a small orbital defense grid that was never intended to withstand a full Dominion assault. Breath warships disabled that grid in less than an hour, and their ground transports descended toward the wide plains north of the main city. Armored carriers touched down across the fields and opened their ramps while Breath soldiers marched forward with the steady confidence of warriors who had conquered dozens of worlds before. The first street of the city was quiet. The second street was quiet as well. By the time the Breath commander's unit reached the third street, a small unease began to creep into his thoughts. There were no civilians running through the roads, and no movement behind the windows of the buildings that lined the narrow blocks. The structures looked empty at first glance, but every door was firmly closed and every street intersection stood strangely silent. The commander ordered a thermal scan of the surrounding buildings. The results arrived almost immediately, and they were not what he expected. The structures were full Every building along the street contained people, sometimes dozens inside a single floor. The civilians were not hiding or attempting to flee through back corridors. They were standing still, waiting inside their homes and offices, as if they had been expecting the breath soldiers to arrive at this exact moment. The first explosive device detonated beneath the road at precisely 600 hours. It was not particularly large, but its placement was perfect. The blast flipped two armored breath carriers onto their sides and collapsed a section of the pavement, blocking the road entirely. Within 40 seconds, the entrances to the street were sealed as remotely operated machines pushed abandoned vehicles across the intersections. At the same time, heavy debris dropped from rooftops above with careful timing, creating barriers that trapped the breath unit in the center of the block. Only then did the doors open. New Carthage had not evacuated because its citizens had chosen to stay and fight. Civilians who had completed civil defense training stepped into the streets alongside former soldiers and young residents who had spent the last 3 years quietly learning how to execute the protocols of Iron Shepherd. They were not wearing military uniforms. They were farmers, teachers, mechanics, and engineers who had decided that if the breath were going to invade their home, they would have to earn every single meter of ground they tried to take. The ROSI was not physically present in New Carthage on that first day. He was watching through a live tactical feed on the screen inside his transport, but he followed every minute of the battle as it unfolded and never once looked away. The breath commanders had expected the colony to fall within 3 days. Instead, the fighting stretched into 3 long weeks, and even after all that time, the Dominion forces never truly controlled the city. While the fighting on New Carthage stretched far longer than breath commanders had predicted, the situation in space was becoming equally confusing for them. The Terran fleet did not gather into a single defensive formation, and it did not attempt to protect one obvious strategic location. Instead, small groups of fast human ships appeared suddenly at the edges of breath supply routes, striking with precision before disappearing back into deep space long before the larger Dominion escort fleets could respond. Within the first 4 days alone, the breath lost 17 supply vessels moving equipment toward the front lines. Shortly afterward, a fuel depot near the border relay was destroyed, followed by the sudden loss of a communications array positioned at the far edge of the Dominion's patrol zone. Breath commanders had no clear term for this kind of warfare. Throughout their long history of conquest, the species they had fought had always attempted to defend something visible. Sometimes it was a planet, sometimes a station, and sometimes a fleet formation positioned between the enemy and its territory. Humanity was not defending anything in the traditional sense. Their ships seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at once, appearing briefly where the breath were weakest before fading back into the darkness of interstellar space. Each time the Dominion fleet attempted to pursue one group of human vessels, another Terran strike group appeared somewhere else, attacking a different target and forcing the breath to divide their attention again. One breath fleet captain named Vareth eventually sent a private message directly to the God King's War Council. In the message, he wrote something that many other commanders had privately suspected, but had not yet dared to state openly. He explained that the humans were not behaving like a civilization struggling desperately to survive. Instead, they were deliberately making every breath movement costly and exhausting. His report ended with a line that none of the other commanders had been willing to put in writing. "They are not afraid of us," he wrote. "They are not trying to escape this war. They are trying to make the war painful enough that we decide to leave. I do not believe we have enough ships to force them to stop." The message was received at high command, but was not welcomed around the same time. One Terran frigate captain named Felix Ward had taken his ship on a long curved course that carried it behind the main breath fleet formation. The Dominion sensors failed to detect the vessel until it was already accelerating toward one of their largest warships. The frigate slammed into the massive breath dreadnought along the port side, just below the primary engine structure. The explosion that followed was large enough to be seen from two other breath vessels positioned several thousand kilometers away. Felix Ward survived the impact. His ship was destroyed during the collision, but he and 11 members of his crew managed to reach an escape capsule moments before the final systems failed. Just before the capsule hatch sealed, Ward opened a broad transmission channel and spoke a short message in a voice so calm it sounded almost casual. New Carthage is still ours. Those 4 words spread across every Terran ship, station, and colony. Within a single hour. Far away at Breath High Command, Sovereign Kefvaris reviewed the battle reports, arriving from the front lines, and felt something he had not experienced in more than a century of rule. It was not quite fear, but it was close, enough to unsettle him. For the first time since issuing the ultimatum, he sensed that the foundation of certainty beneath his authority had shifted in a way he had not expected. To restore control of the situation, he made a decision that he believed would end the conflict. Quickly. He ordered the bombardment of Hesper's Rest. Hesper's Rest was not a military colony, and it possessed no meaningful defensive grid. The world contained a university, 3 hospitals, and an enormous farming network that supplied food to nearly 500,000 people living on surrounding systems. Its population had grown to 2 million residents, many of whom had chosen the colony specifically because it offered a quiet life far from the political centers of Terran space. When the Breath Fleet appeared above the planet, there was no battle waiting for them. The colony transmitted a signal identifying itself as a civilian settlement with no military installations. The Breath Fleet acknowledged the signal. Then it opened fire anyway. The footage from Hesper's Rest reached Earth 6 hours and 14 minutes later. By that time, the Terran War Council had already been in continuous session for 9 days, reviewing reports from every front of the conflict. When the recording appeared on the large screens in the briefing room, no one spoke while it played. Entire districts of the colony burned under orbital fire, and the camera feeds from civilian satellites showed fields, hospitals, and residential towers collapsing beneath the bombardment. A silence in the room was not the silence of shock. Everyone present had been following the war closely and understood exactly what the Breath Fleet had done. It was also not only grief, though grief filled the room heavily. It was the silence of people who had just reached a decision without needing to discuss it aloud. Admiral Leon Faro watched the footage for a long moment after it ended. Then he looked across the long table toward Commander Alarves, who had returned to Earth 2 days earlier and had barely slept since her arrival. Her expression was calm but completely rigid. "They wanted us to beg," she said quietly. No one responded, but every person in the room understood what she meant. "They are waiting for a message asking for peace terms." She rose slowly from her chair. "We are not going to send one." The vote that followed was not about retaliation in the usual sense. It was not a discussion about attacking breath cities or launching large fleet engagements across their border worlds. Instead, the council focused on something far more specific and deliberate. The proposal placed before them defined a single objective for the rest of the war. The target was not the Breath Fleet or their capital city or even their command network. The objective was the Breath Ruler himself, Sovereign Kefvaris. Iron Shepherd had been described to most of the military as a large-scale defense plan, but the Council now revealed its true purpose. For 15 years, a small group of Terran intelligence officers had been assembling a detailed file that they simply called the map. The document contained the location of every breath relay station, the patrol patterns surrounding the Dominion capital world, the precise schedule of the God King's palace guard rotations and a full structural layout of the palace itself. It also included the route of a narrow navigational corridor through Breath territory that was never patrolled. Breath commanders believed no enemy ship would ever attempt such a slow and careful passage through their space. Grace Dunn stood at the front of the room and began guiding the council through the information step by step. She was 34 years old and had spent the last 6 years preparing the presentation they were now seeing. Her voice remained steady as she explained the strategy. "We do not need to win the war the way they expect us to fight it," she said. "We never did." One of the senior council members finally spoke the question that had been sitting in every mind. "In the room, can we actually place someone inside that palace?" Grace turned toward the display showing the corridor route through Breath territory. Her answer came without hesitation. "We already have 1,200 soldiers selected for the operation. We have a ship capable of making the crossing in 18 days without detection. We have detailed plans for every guard position and every interior door inside that building. We have been prepared for this moment for 3 years." The room fell. Silent again, but this silence felt different from the earlier ones. The council members were no longer reacting to the war. They were realizing that the operation being proposed had been waiting long before the Breath ultimatum had ever been sent. Everything had been built for this day. When the vote was called, every hand in the room was raised. On the troop transport where Dara Ozai's unit was stationed, new orders arrived shortly afterward. His team was removed from the new Carthage deployment schedule and assigned to a different mission entirely. They received unfamiliar equipment, along with a detailed briefing that explained the full scope of the operation for the first time. Dara sat with his unit in the cargo bay and listened carefully while the officer described the plan. When the explanation ended, no one spoke for nearly a full minute. Finally, a young soldier named Ivy Cole, only 22 years old and barely 8 months into her military career, broke the silence with a quiet statement. "We are actually going to do this." It was not asked as a question. Dara looked at her and nodded once. "Yes," he said. "We are." The ship selected for the operation was not impressive at first glance. On public registries, it appeared as a slow-moving industrial transport that had spent most of its service life hauling mining equipment between remote colonies. Its hull carried the scars of years of heavy work, and the external scanners mounted along its sides looked outdated compared to modern military vessels. That appearance was intentional. Beneath the outer plating, the ship had been rebuilt almost completely. Its engines redesigned for silent long-range travel, and its internal compartments reshaped to carry far more passengers than its registry suggested. When Dara Asai and the rest of the selected soldiers boarded the vessel, they quickly understood that the ship had been created for only one purpose. The journey through Breath territory required patience above all else. The navigational corridor Grace Dunn had described to the council was not a safe route in the usual sense. It existed only because Breath commanders believed the region held no strategic value. The path passed through an area filled with unstable radiation clouds and drifting fields of metallic debris left behind by an ancient stellar collision. Large warships avoided the sector because the environment interfered with standard sensors, making precise navigation extremely difficult. The Terrans had studied the region carefully for years and had eventually discovered that a small vessel, moving slowly enough, could pass through the field without triggering any detectable signals. The transport entered the corridor 14 days after the vote on Earth. Inside the ship, the soldiers spent most of their time reviewing detailed schematics of the Breath Capital complex. Every hallway inside the palace had been mapped, every elevator shaft measured, and every guard station carefully marked. The soldiers were divided into small teams with specific tasks that had been practiced countless times in simulation chambers back on Earth. Dara's unit was responsible for reaching the central audience chamber where sovereign Kethvares held official gatherings and diplomatic ceremonies. Intelligence reports suggested that the God King spent a significant portion of each day in that chamber reviewing military updates from across the Dominion. The plan required the Terran teams to reach the palace, enter the structure without triggering the primary alarm network, and isolate the ruler before the surrounding security forces could react. It sounded almost impossible when described in a single sentence, but every step of the process had been examined repeatedly by the planners who built Iron Shepherd. They had considered how the breath guards rotated their patrols, how their internal sensors detected movement, and how long it would take reinforcements from nearby barracks to reach the palace interior. Each stage of the mission depended on timing so precise that even a delay of 30 seconds could threaten the entire operation. During the long crossing through the debris corridor, Dara often found himself studying the faces of the younger soldiers in his unit. Ivy Cole sat across from him during most of the briefings, carefully memorizing the interior map of the palace while repeating the entry procedures under her breath. She did not look frightened, though the seriousness in her expression revealed that she understood exactly what they were attempting. None of the soldiers had illusions about the danger waiting for them once they reached the breath capital world. The Dominion's palace guards were considered among the most disciplined soldiers in their entire military. 8 days into the crossing, the ship's captain gathered the team leaders in the command compartment and delivered the latest intelligence update. Breath fleet movements near the capital had increased slightly after the prolonged fighting on New Carthage, but the patrol routes around the palace itself remained unchanged. From the perspective of the Dominion leadership, the war was still focused around the contested colonies near the Terran border. No one inside Breath Command appeared to believe that a human operation could possibly reach the center of their empire. When the meeting ended, Dara returned to the troop bay and sat quietly for a moment before addressing the rest of his team. The room contained 24 soldiers, each one responsible for a different part of the entry sequence once they reached the palace grounds. They had trained together long enough that most instructions required only a few words. Dara reminded them of the approach schedule and confirmed the equipment checks that would be performed during the next shift. Outside the ship, the debris corridor slowly thinned as the vessel approached the outer regions of breath space. If the navigation remained accurate, they would emerge from the field within 2 days and begin the final phase of the journey toward the Dominion capital system. The Terran transport emerged from the debris corridor exactly 41 hours after the final navigation burn. When the radiation clouds faded behind them, the stars of the Breath Dominion filled the forward viewing screens in silent rows of cold light. From that point forward, the ship's movement became even slower and more careful. Its engines operated at the lowest possible output, while the navigation system guided the vessel along routes normally used by civilian freight carriers. On external scanners, the ship appeared no different from hundreds of other aging transports that moved quietly through breath territory every day. That disguise was the only protection the mission truly had. Inside the vessel, the soldiers continued preparing for the operation. Equipment checks were repeated several times each day, while the team leaders walked their units through the entry sequence again and again. Every soldier carried a compact set of tools designed for silent movement through secured structures, along with lightweight weapons built for close-range engagements inside narrow corridors. Dara Asai's team spent long hours studying the interior layout of the palace audience wing, memorizing the distance between doors, staircases, and security nodes that would need to be disabled before the breath guards realized what was happening. As the transport moved deeper into Dominion space, intelligence officers on Earth monitored the journey through encrypted telemetry bursts that were transmitted only once every 12 hours. Admiral Leon Faro rarely left the command center during those days. The large display in front of him showed the projected course of the transport, slowly crossing the map toward the Breath capital system. Each update confirmed that the ship remained undetected, though the margin for error narrowed with every passing hour. The capital world of the Breath Dominion was called Carthus Prime, a planet surrounded by a vast network of orbital platforms, defense satellites, and patrol ships that constantly moved along predictable routes. At the center of the primary continent stood the God King's Palace, a structure so large it resembled a small city built from dark stone and polished metal. The palace complex contained administrative halls, military command chambers, ceremonial courtyards, and private living quarters for the ruler and his court. Tens of thousands of guards, attendants, and advisors lived within the surrounding districts, forming a constant protective barrier around the most powerful individual in the Dominion. The Terran plan did not attempt to confront that protection directly. Instead, the operation depended on entering the system in the same quiet manner the transport had used throughout the journey. The vessel approached Carthus Prime while broadcasting the identification code of a routine supply carrier scheduled to deliver agricultural equipment to a storage facility on one of the planet's outer orbital stations. The code had been obtained years earlier through a carefully arranged intelligence operation that none of the Breath administrators had ever suspected. When the transport reached the system boundary, a Breath traffic controller requested confirmation of the cargo manifest. The ship's captain transmitted the prepared documentation, along with a routine message explaining that the delivery schedule had been adjusted due to delays at the previous port. The exchange lasted less than 2 minutes before the controller cleared the vessel to continue toward the orbital storage platform. Inside the troop bay, Dara and his unit listened to the conversation through a quiet speaker mounted near the equipment racks. No one spoke while the communication continued. When the final clearance signal arrived, several of the soldiers released slow breaths they had been holding for longer than they realized. It was only the first step, but it meant the ship had successfully entered the heart of Breath territory. The transport docked with the outer platform 3 hours later. According to the plan, the ship would remain attached to the station long enough to complete a simulated cargo transfer. During that period, a small shuttle, hidden within the transport's lower compartment, would depart quietly from the far side of the platform and begin the final descent toward the planet's surface. Dara stood near the shuttle entrance with the rest of his team while the countdown clock on the bulkhead moved steadily toward zero. The operation had now reached the stage where even the smallest mistake could expose the entire mission. When the hatch finally opened, the soldiers stepped inside without hesitation and secured themselves in the narrow compartment. The shuttle detached from the transport less than 5 minutes later and began its silent fall toward Carthus Prime. The shuttle entered the upper atmosphere of Carthus Prime under the cover of routine orbital traffic. Hundreds of civilian and administrative craft moved through the planet's approach corridors every hour, carrying supplies, officials, and industrial equipment between the surface and the surrounding stations. The Terran shuttle blended into that traffic pattern with careful precision, transmitting a standard descent signal that identified it as a maintenance vehicle assigned to one of the palace service depots. The identification code had been prepared long before the war began, inserted quietly into the Dominion shipping records during a data infiltration operation that few people even within Terran intelligence fully understood. Inside the shuttle, the soldiers remained completely silent while the vehicle dropped through layers of dark cloud toward the illuminated surface below. The capital city surrounding the palace stretched across the horizon like a sea of lights, its wide roads and towering structures forming an enormous network around the central complex. Even from high altitude, the palace itself dominated the landscape. The structure rose above the surrounding districts in enormous black towers connected by wide stone bridges, and the central audience hall sat beneath a massive dome that reflected the glow of the city lights. DRR studied the scene through the small forward display while the shuttle's navigation system adjusted their descent path. The mission briefing had included detailed images of the palace from orbital satellites, but seeing the place in person created a different impression entirely. The building had been designed to communicate power and permanence. Every wall was thick, every gate reinforced, and every open courtyard surrounded by guard towers positioned with deliberate symmetry. The Breath Ruler had built his residence to look unassailable. The shuttle touched down on a small service landing pad located several kilometers from the main palace entrance. According to the records visible to local administrators, the craft had arrived to deliver diagnostic equipment for a maintenance crew assigned to inspect one of the palace power conduits. The landing area itself was quiet and only lightly guarded, since it normally received nothing more threatening than repair teams and supply shipments. 2 Breath security officers waited near the edge of the pad when the shuttle's hatch opened. They never had time to raise an alarm. The first officer stepped forward to examine the shuttle's identification markings, and Dara's team moved. Immediately, the soldiers exited the craft in perfect coordination, closing the distance between themselves and the guards in a matter of seconds. Compact shock weapons disabled the officers before either one could transmit a warning signal through their armor communication links. The bodies were carefully moved aside while Ivy Cole sealed the landing pad cameras in a continuous loop that replayed the previous 10 minutes of empty footage. Within 4 minutes, the entire team had cleared the landing area and moved toward the nearest service corridor leading into the palace infrastructure. The passageway beneath the landing platform connected to a network of maintenance tunnels that ran through the outer sections of the complex. These tunnels existed so that engineers could access power lines, water systems, and structural supports without disturbing the daily activities of the palace staff. For the Terran soldiers, the tunnels provided the quietest path toward the central audience wing. The team separated once they reached the first major junction in the corridor system. Dara led his unit toward the audience chamber route, while the other groups moved to their assigned objectives, including the communications hub and the internal security station that controlled the palace alarm network. Every movement followed the schedule that had been rehearsed for years in simulation facilities back on Earth. Above them, the palace continued its normal routine. Advisors gathered in meeting rooms, guards rotated through their patrol paths, and the God King prepared for his evening review of the Dominion's military operations. None of them knew that the most dangerous mission humanity had ever attempted was already moving through the walls beneath their feet. The team advanced through the tunnels with careful precision, following the mapped corridors that Grace Dunn had painstakingly documented. Every step was timed to avoid overlapping with scheduled patrols. Every corner was swept for unexpected surveillance devices. Dara's squad moved as a single unit, their eyes scanning, their ears attuned to the hum of machinery and distant footsteps. Communication was limited to subtle hand signals. Even the softest sound could alert the palace's security systems. The corridors twisted and split, but the Terran soldiers remained perfectly coordinated, trusting the map that had been prepared and double-checked for months. As they approached the inner layers of the palace, the tunnels narrowed and became more utilitarian, the walls marked by maintenance conduits, access panels, and faint traces of past repairs. These sections were almost always unguarded, but the team remained alert, knowing the Breath could place traps anywhere. Cora Blake led the technical team, ready to bypass the security nodes that monitored these passages. Every panel they touched was part of a pre-planned sequence. The team had trained endlessly to complete these manipulations without leaving digital or physical traces. Finally, they reached the central lift that would carry them to the throne chamber level. The lift shaft was deep and wide, and the interior maintained the palace's temperature and humidity settings. Dara's squad entered in precise formation, activating the lift with the override codes supplied by Grace. The ride was tense but silent, the hum of the lift the only noise accompanying them as it descended into the heart of the palace. Every second mattered. When the lift opened, the squad entered a corridor lined with polished stone and decorated with ceremonial banners. The floor reflected dim light from the walls, making shadows dance in subtle patterns. Dara's eyes scanned the route to the throne room. The guards had not yet passed this hallway during their rotation. The team moved swiftly and quietly, reaching the massive doors that led to the chamber where Sovereign Kethvarez awaited. Cora deployed her specialized cutting device on the reinforced door. The machine hummed and vibrated subtly, working through the material without triggering any alarm protocols. The seconds stretched into what felt like minutes, but eventually the door began to yield, splitting apart along the pre-designed weak point. The path into the throne room was now open. Dara took a deep breath and signaled the squad to move. They stepped into the chamber with every sense alert, ready for the encounter that would define the war. Sovereign Kethvarez stood at the far end of the throne room, massive and imposing, yet entirely aware of the human's presence. He did not flinch or show surprise. Dara stepped forward, confident and calm. "We know exactly who you are," he said. Kethvarez regarded them in silence, taking measure of the soldiers arrayed before him. In that moment, the God King realized the humans had anticipated every possible reaction, every possible countermeasure. There was no escape, no surprise, no advantage left for him. The restraints were applied to his wrists, firm and unyielding, and Dara opened the secure channel. "The Iron Shepherd is complete," he said, his voice steady. The transmission went live, broadcasting to every human colony, station, and ship. Within hours, the galaxy watched as the God King of the Breath Dominion, ruler of 42 star systems, walked restrained through the streets of New Carthage. The civilians stood silently along the streets, their faces composed and unwavering, as the soldiers escorted him. Commander Alarvis walked beside him, her expression calm and resolute, leaving no doubt about humanity's message. This was the cost of coming for them. The Conclave stations, the Breath Fleet in Terran space, and all observers received the broadcast. Silence followed for a long moment. Within 72 hours, the Breath sent a formal request for peace negotiations. Humanity's reply was swift, clear, and simple. They were ready to negotiate on their own terms. The surviving families of Hesper's Rest, who had lived under the threat for decades, had already defined those terms. The Terran Union had not only survived, it had demonstrated patience, preparation, and resolve across 15 years of quiet readiness. They had refused to bow, worked in secrecy, and then crossed enemy space to make that refusal permanent. The galaxy would remember. Humanity had proven that it did not need to be the largest or oldest power to shape its destiny. It only needed to be patient, determined, and unyielding.